Good evening and welcome to the main English news bulletin for Channel 1 News. You are watching World Affairs with me, Huda Zariwala. Moving on to the top stories for the hour, the Hajj Ministry in cooperation with the Foreign Ministry has issued more than 300,000 Hajj visas electronically to Hajj pilgrims from abroad. Local media said on Tuesday. Zariwala's Hajj Ministry Director General and Supervisor of the electronic portal was quoted as saying that the ministry closely followed the royal directives on providing electronic visas to Umrah and Hajj pilgrims. The reason for adopting this system is to increase the transparency as well as follow up on the performance. The electronic gateway has made it easier to deal with big numbers of visitors, while the implementations of regulations and conditions related have also been eased, he said. Moving on, an Indonesian court has ordered a foundation set up by the former Indonesian director Suharto to pay back about 325 million of embezzled state funds, an official said. The Supreme Court ruled that the huge sum which came from an educational foundation controlled by the Suharto family must be returned, said the court spokesman Suhadi. Army General Suharto ruled Indonesia with an iron fist for more than 3 decades until he was toppled by popular protest in 1998. Graft watchdog Transparency International has labelled him as the most corrupt leader of all times, claiming that he was looted between $15 billion and $35 billion from the country during his time in power. It was set up to provide university scholarships to children from poor families, but the civil lawsuit filed by the Attorney General reportedly alleged the Suharto family had used it to embezzle government money. The latest ruling reversed a 2010 decision that had ordered the foundation to pay a far smaller sum of around 320,000, according to the Jakarta Globe newspaper. His 6 children allegedly amassed fortunes by enjoying privileged access to lucrative business deals. Moving on to Myanmar, where the number of people affected by flooding across Myanmar was approaching 1 million, with waters in the low-lying southwestern delta inundating homes and forcing villagers into temporary shelters, the government said. The death toll was on the verge of topping 100. In some places, only the roofs of the homes could be seen. International aid is on the way following appeals by the government, but so far, most of the help has come from volunteers ferrying noodles, rice and clean water door to door in small boats. Heavy monsoon rains that began in late June, compounded more recently by the cyclone Komen, have triggered some of the Myanmar's worst flash floods and landslides in recent memory. All but 2 of the country's 14 states have been affected. Downstream waters have caused banks to burst, swallowing up rice paddies and homes. The United Nations pledged $9 million in assistance this past week, but so far most help has come from private citizens and non-governmental organizations. Myanmar's appeal was in sharp contrast to its following Cyclone Nargis in 2008, when the nation's then military rulers refused international aid and largely downplayed the destruction, though more than 100,000 people were killed. A nominally civilian government now runs the country, but critics say it's not moving quickly enough to help those in need. Meanwhile, Myanmar's government and military have won rare praise for their handling of the country's deadly floods, helping to erase criticism over a previous disaster and possibly bolstering support before a landmark election in November. Myanmar quickly appealed for foreign aid, set up shelters for flood victims, and cooperated with the same international aid community shunned after Nargis. And meanwhile, in Turkey, warplanes on Tuesday carried out a new wave of airstrikes against Kurdish militants in the southeast of the country in retaliation for a day of bloody attacks that left 6 members of the security forces dead. The military bombed 17 targets of the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is a PKK, in the southeastern Hakkari province, destroying them all, the army said in a statement. Ankara is pressing a prolonged anti-terror offensive against Daesh in Syria and PKK militants in northeastern Iraq and southwest Turkey following a wave of attacks in the country. But so far, the airstrikes have overwhelmingly concentrated on the separatist Kurdish rebels who have responded by tearing up to a 2013 ceasefire and waging a bloody campaign against the security forces. The Marxist-inspired PKK has waged a 3-decade insurgency since 1984 for greater autonomy for Turkey's Kurds that have left tens of thousands of people dead. The Kurds are by far the Turkey's biggest ethnic minority and are often seen as the world's largest stateless people spread between Turkey, Iraq, Iran and Syria. The government has also vowed to begin strikes against Daesh in Syria alongside US forces who have now started arriving to use the well-located Incirlik airbase in South Turkey. Washington has long been pushing its NATO ally Turkey to step up the fight against IS, which Ankara has been reluctant to do so. Turkey last month launched a prolonged anti-terror offensive against the Islamic State jihadists in Syria and PKK militants after a wave of attacks inside the country. But so far, the Kurdish rebels have borne the brunt of dozens of airstrikes, while just 3 have been officially recognized as targeting the IS. So far, 390 terrorists have been rendered incapable of causing harm and another 400 have been injured, while 150 suffering serious injuries, Antonia said. The PKK has meanwhile kept its attacks on the Turkish state, killing at least 20 members of the security forces since the start of the latest cycle of violence that has shattered a ceasefire declared in 2013. In the latest incident, a policeman was killed and another injured in an attack believed to have carried out by the PKK in Midyat, a town predominantly Turkish southeast Turkey, according to the Dogan agency. The PKK's insurgency for greater rights and powers for Turkey's Kurdish minority began more than 30 years ago and has left tens of thousands dead. And meanwhile, Israel has released all suspects detained in raids as part of a probe into the firebombing of a Palestinian home that killed an 18-month-old child and his father, authorities said. They did not provide the number of those detained in the raids early Sunday in Wildcat Jewish settlement outpost in the West Bank near the Palestinian village of Duma, where the July 31st firebombing occurred. Taking a look at China's economical situations, China's yuan hit a year low on Wednesday, falling for a second day after authorities devalued it in a move that sparkled fears of a global currency war and accusations that Beijing was unfairly supporting its struggling exporters. Spot yuan in China fell to 6.45 per dollar, its weakest since August 2011, after the central bank set its daily midpoint reference at 6.3306, even weaker than Tuesday's devaluation. The currency fared worse in international trade, touching 6.59. Foreign exchange traders later said state-owned banks were selling dollars on behalf of the PBOC to keep the yuan around 6.43. The International Monetary Fund said China's move to make the yuan more responsive to market forces appeared to be a welcome step and that Beijing should aim to achieve an effectively floating exchange rate within 2 to 3 years. Beijing has been lobbying the IMF to include the yuan in its basket of reserve currencies known as special drawing rights, which it uses to lend to sovereign borrowers. This would mark a major step in terms of international use of the yuan. The devaluation was condemned by the US lawmakers from both parties on Tuesday as a grab for an unfair export advantage and could set the stage for testy talks when the Chinese President Xi Jinping visits Washington next month, giving acrimony over issues ranging from cybersecurity to Beijing's territorial ambitions. Not all countries consider the devaluation a threat, however. Korea's Finance Minister Choi Kwang-hwan said it would be possible for Korean exports to China, much of which were intermediate items and not in direct competition with the Chinese products. While a weaker yuan will not cure all the ills of China's exporters, which suffer from rising labor costs, it will help relieve deflationary pressure, a far bigger concern in the view of some economists. China's shift serves multiple purposes. Authorities can point to demands by the International Monetary Fund to give market forces a greater role in determining the currency's value. The IMF on August 12 cautiously welcomed the switch, reinforcing the case for including the yuan in the basket of currencies that make up the IMF's special drawing rights later this year. The new exchange rate policy also tallies with the long-standing pledge by China's leaders to let support and demand play a decisive role in the economy. But these are secondary considerations to what looks like the main objective, which is to ease the pressure on China's economy by making the country's sputtering exports more competitive. The PBOC insists that there will be no basis for a sustained devaluation. Investors are paying little attention. In freely traded offshore markets, the exchange rate is now almost 2% weaker than on the mainland. Asian currencies, stock markets and commodity prices are all anticipating further yuan weakness. Given China's slowdown, some weakening in the yuan seems justified. And shifting to a market-driven exchange rate does not mean giving up control entirely. Within foreign exchange reserves of around $3.65 trillion, China has plenty of scope to sell dollars and shore up its own currency. But until the PBOC intervenes, investors will assume its new policy is pointing to a weaker yuan. And it is time for a short break in the world affairs. Do join in for more updates after a short while. welcome to World Affairs. Moving on, senior US lawmakers from both political parties on Tuesday condemned China's surprise currency devaluation as a grab for an unfair export advantage and urged inclusion of currency manipulation curbs in the new Pacific Rim trade deal. Several members of the Congress said the devaluation of the yuan by China's central bank on Tuesday raised serious concerns. Some suggested it was further proof China cannot be trusted on currency policy. China's 2.0% yuan devaluation came weeks ahead of the first state visit to the United States by the Chinese President Xi Jinping amid other tensions over trade, cybersecurity and international development. China's central bank said the devaluation resulted from reforms meant to make its exchange rate more market-oriented. A cheaper yuan will help Chinese exports by making them less inexpensive for importing countries. Some lawmakers said that the move displayed China's intent to manipulate its currency to gain a trade advantage. At least two of the Republican contenders in the 2016 presidential race also weighed in. Today's provocative act by the Chinese government to lower the value of the yuan is just the latest in a long history of cheating, said Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. Real estate mogul Donald Trump, who has frequently promised to be tough with Beijing, told the CNN that they kept devaluing their currency until they get it right. They're doing a big cut in the yuan, and that's going to be devastating for us. However, many economists noted the Chinese currency has been linked to the US dollar for several years and so has risen against other major currencies. In the US dollar has risen 20% in the past year, making Chinese exports less competitively priced than they were, contributing in turn to the recent slowdown in the Chinese economic growth. Meanwhile, in Japan, will bring its restarting its nuclear power program, officials said after a 2-year shutdown sparked by public fears following the Fukushima crisis. The restart comes more than 4 years after a quake-sparked tsunami-triggered meltdowns at the Fukushima plant, prompting the shutdown of Japan's stable of reactors in the country's worst atomic crisis in a generation. Resource-poor Japan, which had its nuclear power for a quarter of its electricity, restarted 2 reactors temporarily to feed its needs. But they both went offline by September 2013, making it completely nuclear-free for about 2 years. Japan has ushered in tougher safety rules to avoid a repeat of Fukushima, including more backup preventive measures and higher tsunami blocking walls in areas more susceptible to them. The government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is keen to set some of the 4 dozen reactors back up and running. So are the power companies that own them, fed up with having to make up lost generating capacity with pricey fossil fuels. The Republican presidential candidate Jeb Bush will step up his criticism of Hillary Rodham Clinton and her tenure as Secretary of State, arguing in a speech on foreign policy the Democratic front-runner shares in the mistakes that he says led to the rise of the Daesh. The former Florida governor and the son and brother of 2 former presidents will also call for a renewed sense of the US leadership in the Middle East, which he says is needed to defeat the militant group and an ideology that is to be borrowed a phase, the focus of evil in the modern world. The threat of global jihad and of the Daesh in particular requires all the strength, unity and confidence that only American leadership can provide, Bush will say, according to the excerpts of his remarks as prepared for delivery. Bush will be addressing some of the key issues in the 2016 presidential election, national security and terrorism. While Bush and Clinton were the biggest names going into the presidential candidate race, lately they have been overshadowed by Donald Trump, the outspoken billionaire magnate and reality television star who has emerged as a frontrunner in the crowded Republican field despite his fiery and controversial rhetoric. Clinton remains the overwhelming favorite for the Democratic nomination. In a speech at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, Bush plans to tie the rise of the militant Sunni group to the departure of US forces from Iraq in 2011. IS occupies a large swath of Iraq and Syria and has a presence somewhere in the Mid-East. ISIS grew while the United States disengaged from the Middle East and ignored the threat, Bush will say. And where was Secretary of the State Clinton in all of this? Clinton says, stood by that hard-won victory by America and allied forces was thrown away. In all her record-setting travels, she stopped by Iraq exactly once, he says. American troops left Iraq in December 2011 as required under the 2008 security agreement worked out by the former President George W. Bush. Both countries tried to negotiate plans to keep at least several thousand US forces in Iraq before the deadline to help keep a lid on the simmering tensions among Islamic sects. The Iraqi government refused to let US forces remain in their country with the legal immunity President Barack Obama's administration insisted was necessary to protect them. Obama, who campaigned for the president on ending the war in Iraq, took the opportunity to remove US forces from the country. Moving on, investigators probing the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine said they had identified pieces that possibly came from a Russian-made Buk missile where the plane crashed. International and Dutch investigators are probing several parts possibly originating from a Buk surface air missile system, said a joint statement from prosecutors and the Dutch Safety Board. These parts have been secured during a previous recovery mission in East Ukraine and are in the possession of the Criminal Investigation Team and the Dutch Safety Board, it said. Asked whether the parts were found at the crash site, Dutch public prosecutor spokesman Wim de Bruin said he could not be more specific than in eastern Ukraine. Flight MH17 was shot down on July 17 last year, killing 298 people. Ukraine and many in the West have accused pro-Russian rebels of shooting down the plane, saying they may have used a Buk missile supplied by Russia. Russia and the rebels deny any responsibility and point the finger at Ukraine's military. The joint investigation team carrying out the criminal probe into the crash consists of the Netherlands, Ukraine, Australia, Malaysia and Belgium. International air investigators, comprising representatives from the Netherlands, Ukraine, Malaysia, Australia, Britain and the United States and Russia, are currently meeting in The Hague to discuss a draft OVV report into what caused the crash. The statement from the OVV and JIT said that the pieces are being investigated, possibly provide more information about who was involved in the crash of the MH17. For that reason, the JIT further investigates the origin of these parts. And these are all the top stories for now. For more news updates, keep watching World Affairs. This is Huda Zariwala signing off. Good night.